Great. Thank you very much, and great to see you all there in Cambridge. Sorry that I cannot be there to join you. I look back fondly on a number of visits there some time ago. So today I'm going to tell you a bit about the Mapping the Polar Data Ecosystem project. And I'm joined, there are a few people in the room there. I believe Oystein and Jan Rene may be there in person, but I'll present on our behalf. So the MPDE project, as it's known, the rationale behind it, or the why we engaged in this project to begin with, was really about identifying, documenting, but most importantly, understanding the polar components of our broader global information system. So we always talk about this, huge information system that's evolved, particularly over the last 3 decades. And it was really clear that the polar community had a big footprint there, but it was not clear on exactly what that community or what those systems looked like. So we wanted to do that for a number of reasons. So one was to look at gaps. So that was where some of the initial conversation came from, is what are we missing, but also what's there, and how can we support the development of these interconnections, not only between and among the members of the polar community, but also as part of the global community. And we really are part of that. So we know, partners like World Data System and many others, Geo and all kinds of others who we've connected with over time. We're really sort of making that global connection, but also right down to the local scale as well. And so when we were doing this, we were looking at different sort of what I'll call value propositions. Supporting livelihoods came up again and again. We're talking there, particularly in the Arctic context, where communities are being impacted by the changes that we're seeing, both socially, economically, climate change, and so on. We also were thinking about overall coordination within the community, governance, to put that sort of in lowercase g governance, not looking at getting sort of complex, but just how do we work together and so on. Research and then all kinds of other applications have come up, and fundamentally we're looking at connections. So how do we connect our community, and then supporting decision making. So constantly we're having questions like, well, who's in the community? Where are they at? Where's the infrastructure? Are there hubs, et cetera, that we need to connect? So that's why we started this initiative. In terms of history, it started at the first meeting, actually, of the Arctic Data Committee in Helsinki in 2014. And there we had brought together a number of different actors in the community. And it became clear to us very early in that meeting that we didn't have everybody that was needed at the table. And the funders that were involved in organizing that meeting as well were very clear that they didn't have a good view of the community. So we spun up the project that was initially the mapping the Arctic data ecosystem, but then evolved over time into the mapping the polar data ecosystem. So around 2018, with the Polar Data Planning Summit, or PDPS, that was held in Boulder, we connected with SCADM and SUSE to move this forward, and then partnered with Polder as well, a group that I think you're all familiar with. And so that really evolved actually as a result of the Polar to Global Data Hackathon that started in 2020. And so we've been engaging in the process there. I won't go into a lot of the background, but there is a publication that's on the screen here if you're interested, and we're trying to build on this idea of information ecology. And this goes back actually many years in the polar community. For any of you old enough to remember the sort of International Polar Year, or IPY, in 2007 to 2009, there's a lot of talk about the data ecosystem. And one of the things that's sort of foundational in terms of approaches is not wanting to just simply think of this as a report or a spreadsheet or something, but to be able to actively share our findings. So that's where I'll talk about the developments to date and where we're going as well. So in practical terms, the project started out as an online simple diagram, if you will, but it was actually an interactive diagram. So when we started the collection of data, which was primarily just sending emails, doing research online, trying to connect with people who were in the community, and documenting that, we used a really simple tool. It's called MindMeister. It's sort of a mind mapping type tool. Allows you to create diagrams, but also hyperlink and so on. So that for the moment is still there on the Arctic Data Committee site, but with the new executive, we're working with them to do a bit of a revamp of the site, and so this will be archived. But it gave us a really easy and good start. And this is where we really started to recognize the size and complexity of the system. And I think we had over 200 entities within a few months mapped out. The second iteration, we moved from a pretty simple tool to a more custom application. And this is still hosted actually at University of Colorado, where I used to work. It was developed in partnership with Brendan Billingsley. And what I think this brings is sort of more advanced visualization, but also starting to recognize that it's not simply a pretty picture, but it's actually an information system that we're developing. And so this has a database backend, and specifically what's called a triple store or linked open data database that you can use to filter and to interrogate the data and create different views and so on, so that you can analyze. This is also the first iteration where we built on the partnership with Polder and started taking the information, the data that they had been collecting, starting with the Polar Data Planning Summit, and using it in this system to help with visualization and so on. So fast forward to today, our current iteration, we moved the initial prototype into a platform called Nunalite, which is developed primarily by the group that I work with at Carleton University now, the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center. We've been using it for, I guess, almost 20 years now on various projects with communities and different applications. And we moved the system into this to take advantage of a lot of this sort of out of the box functionality in terms of visualization, but also having things like account management, the ability for people to come in and edit and so on. So I'll talk more about that in a few slides. We also linked it to mapping. So not only do we have a graph or a diagram of the different connections, and if you look at this live, you can actually hover over and so on. I realize I don't have a URL on this, but I will let you know that at the end of the presentation. So current activities, we've been quite active in the project, and particularly thanks to some funding and activity by Arctic Passion, European Commission initiative that was funded a couple of years ago. My group at GCRC and also partners at the Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability, or CCADI as we call it, and Brendan Billingsley Custom Software, are all working together under the Arctic Passion flag and funding. And so much of the focus to date has been on enhancing the existing polar data in particular, but also the initial prototype that I showed you, actually the second prototype that was built on the initial one, included other data. So not strictly the polar data that's looking at linkages between metadata catalogs and so on, but also just broader connections, etc. So we're moving that data over to the new prototype, and then I'll talk in more detail at the end of the presentation, expanding the content to other systems. A big part of this, as I said, has been just working with the community. So much of the effort there has been part of that initiative. Another activity within the current work is developing and sharing the data model, or as I'll explain, models. So data model emerged through this initial prototyping and work. Data was being collected, used, and so on. And so more recently, particularly under the work of Øystein Godoy, who's in the room with you, is is formalizing that. And a website, or sorry, a GitHub repo has been added to the overall folder repository in GitHub. And so that's included there. We're currently documenting using just, textual documentation and entity relationship diagrams. But in the next phase, we'll look at formalizing that as well through formal ontology in RDF. At the moment, the database is implemented in NoSQL database, or a document-oriented database, some people will call it. And so that in real terms means that the data is in JavaScript object notation, or JSON. And that's what lives inside the Noonly platform, which sits on top of a database called CouchDB. So initially, we're focusing on the folder model, but again, that model is focused on a particular type of interaction and data. But we know we're going into other projects that will go sort of use different types of relationships or go beyond that. So we're designing this for extensibility, where we would inherit what we currently have, but also be able to add elements and so on. So we're refining the prototype, loading updated and new data. I've already talked about. There's some new modules coming I'll talk about in a few slides. And then enhancing the user experience, the user interface, and the visualization. And a big development that we're working towards is adding user accounts and roles. So the platform we're working on, one of the reasons we adopted is it's developed for what we call participatory mapping, or sort of user contributed content. So it will allow the representatives from the particular organizations that are part of the graph or part of the map to come in and keep their records up to date, add information, etc. So we're looking at that as a really important development. We're also, after our next iteration of data loading, we're looking at preparing to implement an API. So when we move from the second version to the third, we actually lost the API, but we're going to re-implement that as a Sparkle endpoint, but also potentially other APIs, so you can download CSV, possibly OGC standards, etc. So just to wrap up, in terms of our next steps, we're continuing to engage the community. So that's just a living activity, ongoing, constantly happening. We really need and want to work with you because the big value of this system is in the data, is in understanding, who's out there, what they're doing, and making sure that data is current and up to date, and so on. So Jan René Larsen is the primary contact there. And so you see his email there, and you can reach out to him if you're interested. And soon enough, as I said, we'll be establishing those accounts and allowing you to do direct editing on the new platform. Another initiative came out of another European Commission project that I was part of, along with NERSC in Norway, called Capartis, and there we did a report and some research on establishing what we'll call an Arctic standards framework. So we're looking at migrating that information from the report, and some of this work has been done as part of the initial project into the ecosystem mapping, so we can understand not only how data or metadata is moving, but also the different standards organizations and framework. And then lastly, over time, we would like to move towards a system where, not all of this is done by human interaction, where people are entering the data and so on, but taking advantage of the kind of metadata harvesting, et cetera, that's going on now, where things can be harvested and automatically populate the database. So I'm going to leave it there and say thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. Questions from the floor? Yes, at the very back.
Hi, Peter, it's Shannon. I don't have a question, but I was going to remind you that you're going to put the URL up for us.
Great, I will do so. I'm actually going to put it in the chat, but it's basically mpde.gcrc.carleton.ca, and Carleton is spelled with an E in the middle there. Sorry, it misspelled in the chat.
We'll make sure to get it out. Other questions for Peter? We do still have some time. I've got one for you then, Peter. Are you looking at running any metrics over the graph, like looking at critical nodes or even weighting the graph for frequency or things like that?
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question. We do have a couple of things that we're doing before that, but one of the things I'm working on with a colleague here at my university, actually, who specializes in what's called spatial social networks, and has actually developed software in the R platform that allows us to do that kind of analysis. So one of the big reasons for the API that I talked about earlier in the presentation is to be able to link it to other platforms. And so R has already some built-in social network analysis capability to do the types of things you're talking about, but we also want to factor in location. So that's actually, I'm looking to line up a postdoc or a PhD student probably to do some really hopefully interesting work on that. But to do that, we really need to get to the point where the data set is fully developed so that we can actually analyze it in that way.
Sounds like a great opportunity.
If I can add, as Peter said, in our current collection of data centers or nodes, we have approximately 100 of these, and many of you will be owners of these nodes or contact persons. So you can expect an email from us where we have offered you an account into the system, asking you kindly to go into the system and review your information there. We are especially interested, of course, in your relationship with other data centers, the technicalities around how you do your harvesting from that. So you can expect an email from us. If your data center or node is not already within the system, we are, of course, we want to expand the compilation there so it's so comprehensive as it can get. And for the analysis, that question about the analysis, we actually have a deliverable for the Arctic Passion, this EU-funded project, where we are to provide a report on this, and the report with these statistics will be a natural part of that report. So we'll provide a comprehensive report on structure, traffic, etc.
That sounds great. Thank you very much again.